All right. Okay, so I'm very pleased to have with me today. Oh, actually, tell me how you pronounce your name.
Ames, Eric Ames.
Ames or Eames?
Ames.
Ames, got it. Okay. I did one of these interviews once before, and I mispronounced the person's name, and then he stopped me 10 minutes in and said, "We should go back and redo that introductory part." Okay, here we go. So I'm very pleased to. I'm going to start again. So I'm very pleased. I'm trying to get it not to go back to you. I'm very pleased to have with me today Eric Ames. He is a penetration tester at a company called FusionX, and we're going to talk to him today about what he does at FusionX and about penetration testing. So Eric, welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us how did you get involved in computer security, and maybe you can say a bit more about your background.
Okay. So in school, I majored in computer engineering, computer science, like program, focusing on development. I thought I wanted to be a developer. I worked for a couple of years on a large-scale software project with about 30 other developers and decided that doing that full-time was not necessarily for me. And so I had an opportunity to get involved as a junior security guy with another company, and I was the low man on the totem pole. So they called me the virus boy. I was kind of the guy that responded to virus incidents, and I did that for a little while. And at the same job, they needed someone to look at the security of the printers. That was sort of a low man on the totem pole kind of job. So I started my career penetration testing printers, and what can you do with a printer. And so after playing with it a while, I was man in the middling my printers and bringing up people's documents on my screen and things like that. So that's kind of where I got into the field a little bit. And then the next job, subsequent jobs got me a little bit closer and closer to what I wanted to do.
So now you work at FusionX. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the company does and what you do in particular at the company.
Okay. So FusionX specializes in penetration testing. Really, my bosses don't even necessarily like the words penetration testing right now because they feel like it's perhaps a little bit watered down. There's no real universal agreement on what standard a penetration test has to meet. So they would probably call themselves cyber security exercise or cyber security assessment or something like that. But it's the basic idea of a penetration test where we go in and we're simulating an advanced adversary trying to do whatever an advanced adversary would want to do to their organization. Could be stealing personal information or financial secrets or company sensitive information of some kind. And then me, I'm one of the penetration testers in that company, so I will travel sometimes I'll work remotely, but a lot of times I'm working on trying to break into an enterprise in some way. Could be through spear phishing or applications vulnerabilities or network vulnerabilities, but somehow I'm trying to break in, and then once I'm in, pivot to find something that an attacker would want to find.
Got it. So maybe you can say a bit more about the steps involved in a penetration testing engagement, right? Your company provides this service, so then another company comes along and says, hey, we'd like you guys to come do a penetration test, say, on our network running various applications. What are the steps of performing that penetration test? What do you do?
I think the first step is probably just agreeing on the scope of the test. Trust is so important because they're basically hiring you to break into their network, and if they can't trust you, you're not going to get anywhere. So I think settling on a scope and rules of engagement would probably be the first step. Once we get into the technical part of it, I would say reconnaissance, trying to figure out where your targets are. A lot of companies, especially big companies, don't even necessarily know everywhere that they're on the internet. So part of it, before you even start, really is finding out where they are and getting kind of the lay of the land. Then I would say kind of comes a enumeration / scanning phase, exploitation phase, and I would say those two are not necessarily I do all of the enumeration and then all of the exploitation. I think if I find a vulnerability, I'll go with that vulnerability and see where it takes me. So I probably would do enumeration, exploitation, what I would call probably exfiltration, getting once I compromise a machine, getting all the valuable information off of that machine that could help me then to pivot to somewhere else. So it could be maybe I've gotten passwords off of a machine, I want to reuse those passwords somewhere else. So I would say those phases, enumeration, exploitation, exfiltration, and pivoting, kind of come in chunks, and then I repeat that process until I have the goodies that I want or the assessment ends. And then I'd say it finishes off with reporting.
So in those different phases that you discussed, I imagine a bunch of it is manual sorts of stuff where you're typing stuff into website consoles, you're trying out to see whether they might be vulnerable to cross-site scripting or directory traversal or something like that. But I imagine other parts of it involve automation and tools. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the tools that you use and maybe the higher level techniques that you employ when you out your penetration tests.
Okay, so we try not to do too much automated scanning, but we do have a bunch of tools that we like. Part of what we try to do is when we're simulating an adversary, we don't necessarily want to rush in there with Nessus or another noisy vulnerability scanner because that can give you away very quickly. And part of what we want to test is how far can we get before we get detected by their IDS or whatever kind of defenses that they have. So we like to do more surgical, manual type of testing. That said, I love doing web application penetration tests. I love Burp Suite. It's probably my favorite tool for that. Zap also works well. I like Burp Suite a little better, but Zap is nice.
Is Burp Suite, remind me, is that open source or is there only professional versions of that?
There is a free version that is limited, but the professional version is relatively cheap. I believe it's in the range of $200 a year or something like that. So for a company, it's not much. For an individual, it might be a bit much. But that's probably the professional version of Burp Suite is probably my favorite tool. Otherwise, Zap. And a lot of manual testing. We talked about Bad Store before. That's a great example where you can go through and manually, one at a time, and usually this gets well under people's radar, try out SQL injection and cross-site scripting and command injection and attacks like that. I also like Metasploit, not so much for the automated exploit packages like buffer overflows. I feel like in Metasploit are maybe not as useful as they once were. They're not as up to date. People don't share their exploits as much as they used to. I like the auxiliary modules though. There's a lot of good auxiliary modules that will help. Gosh, I can't think of any right now. But there's a million of those that I like to use a lot. So I'd say those are common tools. Oh, Nmap I use all the time. We try to scale back Nmap so as not to be detected. So we won't throw it at 1,000 ports at once or 65,000 ports at once. We might throw it at 10 ports that we know, 2 seconds between packets, just to see very slowly and stealthily what's on a network.
You bring up an interesting point, which is sort of the difference between a penetration test that is really completely and totally simulating an adversary and a penetration test that maybe is not so worried about stealth and is more brute forcing a system to try to see whether it's going to fall over and be susceptible to certain sort of vulnerability. So I could imagine, for example, a developer of a web application might use something like Nessus, which you mentioned, to see whether or not their site would be susceptible, and that would be great. And then later, when a corporation or whatever is trying to assess their overall posture with all of their different, you have an IDS system, like you said, you have host firewalls, you have printers, whatever. You want to see how does the entire network stand up, and that includes detection. So you have to worry about being stealthy.
That's a good point. Once in a while, we'll get to a customer that just is completely overwhelmed and they have no idea what's going on in their own network. And for a customer like that, we will recommend. We try not to give brand names, but Nessus is as good as any. Where it's a good starting point. If you run Nessus and you have 50 critical vulnerabilities, you're probably not even ready for a penetration test yet. It's something that a company can or an organization can buy on their own and run on their own and just get cover the basics. And once Nessus comes back fairly clean, then maybe it's time to think about a penetration test. But up until that point, you're going to get so many results. It's not going to be as valuable to you, I would think.
So I wonder if you can tell us about some of the more common mistakes that get found during penetration tests, and maybe some of the more infrequent mistakes that you tend to find.
Sure. Default passwords, very, very common. It happens all the time. I find a lot of open shares, SMB shares, NFS shares, web servers that serve up sensitive information, FTP, anonymous FTP servers that serve up sensitive information. And by that I usually mean passwords, maybe private encryption keys. SQL injection is very common, cross-site scripting is very common. And then going a level deeper, maybe a flat network. I did a penetration test once at a hotel where I sit down at the concierge desk and plug in. And I was at the hotel's main domain controller. It was all connected together. So by being on the office area of one hotel, I could get to the same as our intercorporate network where all their sensitive information is. That's an example of a flat network. So it's just a whole design problem. That's very common. Or maybe just reusing passwords so extensively that if you get the admin password on one machine, you've got the admin password for every machine in the whole organization. Those would be all common ones. Less common.
It's interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt. How many of the things that you listed are not sort of application level vulnerabilities? There are the ways that people use their applications by, as you were saying, using poor passwords or organizing their site so that maybe URLs could be guessed and secret information could be taken out because they haven't put, say, a web access control policy in and they're relying on what they thought was secrecy that wasn't really there. Is that accurate? Is a lot of stuff really can be fixed with configuration rather than, say, software upgrades or changing software itself?
You're right. I focused mostly on network and not on software-specific vulnerabilities. I think those are the things that allow us to pivot from one to another more easily. I think getting that initial foothold is probably the hardest part of any penetration test. Getting that first level of access where you have something that you can then turn around and go somewhere else. And a lot of those are software vulnerabilities. Maybe cross-site scripting. I'd say SQL injection more often. Command injection is great when you can get it. Directory traversal. Maybe you could upload a web backdoor and get a shell that way. So I'd say the application level vulnerabilities sort of get me in the door, and maybe these configuration network vulnerabilities allow me to go from that level to the next level.
Before you get to the infrequent ones, another thing I observed in what you were saying before with the hotel example that you were able to plug into the network. One of the things we talk about in the course is having a threat model where you think carefully about what you think your adversary can do. And I think a mistake that people make, and maybe you can tell me what you think about this, is that they don't explicitly consider who their adversary is. They don't think that the adversary has this capability or this capability. I wonder to what extent, say, a hotel thinks that, well, anybody could plug into your network, and if they do, what sort of capabilities will they have? Are they still protected? Whereas if they had thought more carefully about who their potential adversaries were and maybe the risk of those potential adversaries, they might have done more to protect themselves.
Yeah, and this gets into sort of the human causes of vulnerabilities. I mean, I think there's a temptation to look at it as all technical. And this problem, this problem, this problem. We fix these problems, then everything is solved and we're all happy. But there's always a human cause. And a lot of times there is, sometimes it's ego that no one could ever hack into our system because it's so great. And sometimes it's ignorance of, well, we don't necessarily have anything that an adversary would want. Why would they want to attack us? We're just this small company. But every company has something. Every company's CEO probably has some email he doesn't want on the front page of the paper. Everybody's got something, or even if it's just the horsepower of your machines, you have something to offer an adversary. So I think there is that is a very frequent thing we run across, that people underestimate what they have to offer a criminal, and then also overestimate their own defenses. And so one thing that we, as a penetration tester, we try to go in to do is a little bit is shock and awe. We try to go in there and get them spun on their heels and get their head spinning so fast after a couple of weeks that they're ready to sign us for more work. And it's I don't think it's unique to our company. I think it's every penetration testing company kind of likes to do that. So then hopefully their eyes open up and say, wow, we need more help. It's more business for us, and also it's good for them in the long run, because then now they're aware of problems that they had ignored before.
One thing that that occurs to me is that while I imagine big companies have their own penetration testing teams. I'm sure Google has in-house folks, security folks that are doing penetration testing. Maybe smaller companies can't afford it, but that bigger companies might nevertheless benefit by having an outside group come in, because they don't have the same blinders on, and they don't have the same biases due to the corporate culture that an outside group might have, and they might come at the problem a little differently, and therefore find things that the company itself just was unable to see.
Yeah, I've been in both situations, working for a small company now, or working as a very small unit of a large company before. And in my experience, it's not even, if you're that guy that's working for a large company, it's not even that you don't want to find the large vulnerabilities, or maybe you're not even that you're not able to. I feel like as an outsider, you maybe get a little more respect and a little more freedom. Whereas if you work for the organization, oh yeah, you're always complaining that it's not that bad. And I think your comments maybe get a little more swept under the rug if you work for that company, or there's other political competing interests that maybe have a louder voice than you do. Whereas I think if you come in from the outside and you get buy-in at a high enough level within their organization, if you get buy-in from an executive level, then those guys, the executives, can say they're going to do the test, and you're not going to put these artificial restrictions on them, and we're going to find out what we find out, because we want to know the real deal. That is a very common thing I've seen in my career, where you're maybe doing a penetration test for some middle manager who doesn't want to look bad, and so he will artificially limit your scope, and the results are not realistic. So I think as a pen tester, one of your jobs when you set that rules of engagement and try to set that scope in the beginning, it's in everybody's interest if you push a little harder, because you don't want to get to the end and have an artificially limited scope, and then you don't find very much, and everybody thinks the whole thing was a waste of time, and nobody's happy. So what you want to do is you really want to push them in that direction in the very beginning, saying, look, we really want, it's important that we simulate a real scenario, because we don't want to be dismissed later on when they say, well, that wasn't realistic to start with.
And you certainly, you guys, neither you nor the customer wants to be in a position where the penetration test was successful, but then later on an adversary is able to penetrate because you were not allowed to find the way in that the adversary chose.
Sure. Exactly.
So let's go back. I interrupted you before. Maybe you could talk about some of the maybe surprising or unusual things that you found during penetration testing engagements.
Okay. One example I thought of was that, one time I was just opening up a listener on it was an internal network penetration test, and I connected my laptop to the internal network, and I had a listener, I think it was for a part of a Metasploit exploit I was running, and I had a port listening, I think port 443, and arbitrarily a host on their internal network connected to me and tried to authenticate to my server with domain administrator credentials. So just by listening, he connected to me and gave me the password of the domain administrator, which was, made things very easy for me. I like it when, as a pen tester, I like it when they connect to me and just give me their password without me asking for it. So that was unusual. I was going to say before, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit, I think the age of buffer overflows from Metasploit that are point and click and get you admin access, those days are going away, and it's pretty rare that scenario comes up now where I run into a device and there's a perfect exploit for it, either a Metasploit or somewhere else already coded for me and all ready to work. We don't do a lot of that. I think that was more 10 years ago, and now it's a little more manual testing and configuration problems.
Okay. I wonder if you could say a little bit, maybe from your experience or from those you work with, about what else, aside from penetration testing, security conscious organizations do to make the security of their systems better. You know, if you go to a penetration test and the company that you're testing actually, you know, does a good job, do you know anything about what do they do to create such a secure network?
Sure. I think what you do is you plan defense in depth. You plan for a situation where someone in your organization is going to click on an email link that they shouldn't have. You're not going to be able to get everyone to not fall for a phishing scam. Someone's going to click on it. So one user will get compromised, then what? Does that user's workstation, for example, have the same password, local administrator password, as every other user workstation or every other server even? So that kind of thing, the flat network thing that I alluded to before. How good is network segmentation? If one person's, say an employee at a bank clicks on an email, is that on the same network as their ATMs or customer account numbers, for example? So I think it's planning your network in such a way that one compromise doesn't mean game over for your whole organization.
Got it. I wonder if you could say a little about what you perceive to be, and maybe this is related to the limitations of penetration testing. What should companies expect to get out of it, and what maybe shouldn't they expect to get out of it, and therefore they need to look elsewhere?
Okay. The limitations, I think, a penetration test is usually not, in fact, it's never going to be an exhaustive catalog of all vulnerabilities on your network. They're limited by time and money and how much the customer wants to spend. So you're going to find a representative subset of vulnerabilities. You're not going to find all vulnerabilities. But if you kind of look at the root causes of these vulnerabilities, say you find 5 instances of default passwords. That's probably not every instance of default password on their entire network, but there's a problem of process. Why were these devices deployed with default passwords in the first place? Why is there some kind of process or testing or something that they can do to ensure this doesn't keep happening over and over again? Because even if they fix those 5, if 5 new ones are deployed next year, you're in the same boat. So yeah, the limit is you're not going to find everything, and you can't. I don't know any penetration testing company that gives companies their customers a guarantee, where once we pen test you, you'll never get hacked again. It would be. It would be a very good business model.
I would think that such a guarantee would be predicated on nothing about the network ever changing again, which would be violated the next day, right?
Sure.
Because the moment you stick a new printer on the network or you install a new software module, I mean, you might have introduced a new vulnerability, and that's something the penetration testing team could not have found.
Right.
I wonder if you can say a little bit about undergraduate education and advanced training. I mean, you mentioned your background was as a developer, and then you sort of, after your schooling, learned these skills sort of on the job and grew in your expertise. Do you think that that path was fine and everyone should take it, or should undergraduate and graduate education or maybe training do more to support penetration testing as an industry?
When I was in school, there was no penetration testing class. It wasn't an option. Maybe I would have gone a different way had that been an option, or if I had even. It wasn't honestly even on my radar at that point in my life. I think it's great that it's starting to come up more and more. I think it's very helpful. I think, but it's going to be based. A student's ability to get a job in the field is really going to be based on how much they've individually learned from it. I think I've been in roles before where I've been involved in. I was the lead at my last company for the penetration testing team, so I was involved in hiring decisions, and we didn't see a lot of people with undergraduate focuses in penetration testing. I still think a lot of colleges are catching up, by adding that to the curriculum. But we saw a lot of certifications like CEH and CISSP and things like that. And I found that I really wasn't, at least speaking for the certifications, I really wasn't that impressed with people that had them. A lot of them are multiple choice tests, and people who pass them have not necessarily ever even used Nmap. They just passed the multiple choice test about it. And I think, putting my hiring hat on, I would be very interested to talk to somebody who had a degree in penetration testing. That would definitely get them the interview and get them in the door. But then they would still have to convince me that they retain the material, they know it, they use it, they're familiar with it. I think every penetration testing manager has something, whether it's some kind of written test or technical interview or hands-on exercise. We've all got something, because there's no, that we've seen, there's no golden standard that when everyone has this certification, that means they're golden and they're qualified.
I mean, I would worry, frankly, that just like any other aspect of computer science and technology, that such a standard, if you had it, would be invalid in just a few years' time, right? I mean, if you look at the rise of the web, or you were even just mentioning sort of this shift away from buffer overflows. I mean, I think in general people are much better about patching these days. A lot of the culprits of buffer overflows are getting those patches out faster. Mm-hmm. And so we've moved away from that as a problem, and now these new sorts of problems with web-based vulnerabilities, with mobile devices, mm-hmm. are coming up. So my impression, I'm just thinking about this course that we're offering on software security. A lot of it is about how does computing work? How does the network? How does the web work? And where are these strange interactions? Where are there opportunities to make mistakes that attackers can exploit? So if you want to be a good pen tester, you have to really understand how people build things a certain way so that you can take advantage of the mistakes that they commonly make. Yeah. Is my own impression.
Agreed.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so I guess just one last question, which is, having worked in this field for quite a while, in penetration testing and in computer security generally, how have things changed over time? Like you said, 10 years ago it was one thing, now it's something else. If you look over that arc of the past 10 years and maybe you look ahead to the next 5, how do you see things changing as far as computer security goes?
You know, 10 years ago I thought I was in the golden age of hacking, and then it just only got blown up more and more and more since then. I wish I could paint a idealistic future where security is solved. I personally don't feel that's the case. I think I kind of got to this a little bit before, but I think there are human reasons why security is a problem. It's not just technical reasons. There's ego, there's fear of looking bad, there's ignorance of the problem, there's not wanting to hear bad news. Sometimes it's political problems within the organization. Maybe the Chief Information Security Officer reports to the CIO, and the CIO's primary objective is just keeping everything running, keeping everything smooth, and he doesn't want to hear the problems. They don't get reported up. So I've seen a lot of those things. And I think these things are going to continue to be problems because they're human nature, a lot of them.
Right, unless there's some strong, I guess what you're saying is there's sort of an incentive problem, that right now the incentives are still in favor of people minimizing the engagement, of pretending there's no problem because they're not getting called on it. If something bad happens, somehow they're not losing their jobs or they're able to get away with it. And as a result, this kind of stuff is just going to keep happening. They're not willing to take stronger measures.
I think it's going to diverge more and more. I think there's going to be a subset of people who have had a terrible incident, or their mindset is particularly pro-security for whatever reason. And I think, I don't know if that's the 10% or 20%, but I think they're going to get better, and they're going to be aggressive about it, and they're going to be better in 3 years than they are today. I think the rest are just going to kind of keep their heads down, not try to ruffle the boat, and just kind of coast along and hope that there's no problems. And there may be some problems.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know. So here at Maryland, in our cybersecurity center, we
Mhm.
have several people that look at sort of the public policy and economics and that sort of angle of things. And it's very challenging, right? I mean, the legislature, for example, has for many years claimed that they want to pass some sort of comprehensive legislation, and they've just never been able to do it because
Mhm.
the downsides of restricting what people can do with security just seem to be too high. And yet, since that time, we've had breaches of Home Depot and Target, and had lots and lots of people's personal information be disclosed, which is a drag on the economy. And so I don't know until things. I guess I agree with you. Until things get bad enough, only a certain set of maybe those who are directly affected, I think, are going to be motivated to change. And the question is, when is the sea change going to happen, where people will pay attention to all the work that people like yourself and folks here at our center are trying to do?
Mhm. Yeah, it's hard to know. Yeah, I think it's got to come from the top down, and I think the fact that we are seeing these things in the paper now, whereas we weren't seeing them in the paper 5 years ago. But you have got Target in the paper every day, and Home Depot in the paper, and all these cyber attacks in the paper now. If nothing else, the ignorance or level is falling a little bit, where people no longer think that there's no real threat. Um, so so we do have that going for us. Whereas they are willing to take things a little bit more seriously now and hopefully um, dig a little deeper and make the changes they have to, because it's not easy. And when we go in and do a penetration test, we tell people you're not going to be better next month. You're not going to be really better in 6 months. It takes a couple of years to get all the um, organization and the right the organization right, to get the network right, to get the software right, to get the processes right. It takes a while. It's a hard problem.
Well, I think that's an excellent note on which to end. So thank you very much for joining me for this interview and for sharing your insights.
All right, no problem. Had a good time.
Great. Okay, we'll cut it off there somewhere.
Okay.
So there's a YouTube link. Can you see it in the corner, the lower right? Here,
Hmm.
I just pasted it into the chat.
Ah.
So
Yes.
eventually it'll show up at that link.
Okay.
Let me see here.
Oh, there I am. Okay. Got it. Oh, you just went quiet.
Oh, I should stop. I should stop this. Okay, now it's back. I'm gonna